The Vorton Military Institute occupied an entire moon. Not a small moon, mind you, a proper, respectable celestial body with its own gravitational field, atmosphere processors, and enough square kilometers of training grounds to simulate every imaginable hellscape the galaxy had to offer. For 300 cycles, it had produced the finest military officers in 12 star systems, churning out leaders who understood the delicate art of interstellar warfare. The formal declarations, the honor-bound single combat, the weeks of strategic posturing that preceded any actual violence. Civilized species, you see, didn't just shoot each other. That would be barbaric. The Academy's marble halls held monuments to legendary battles where wars were decided by champion duels lasting hours, where opposing commanders exchanged poetry before crossing swords, where entire fleets waited patiently while their chosen representatives settled matters with appropriate dignity. This was warfare as it should be, refined, controlled, almost balletic in its execution. Then humanity submitted their application for membership in the Galactic Concordat, and someone in the administrative offices made what future historians would call a significant oversight. They approved it. The Human Integration Program was in its third year now, and the Academy's staff had developed what they believed was a comfortable understanding of these newcomers. Humans were diplomatic, they'd concluded. A bit excitable, perhaps overly fond of chemical stimulants and raising their voices during discussions, but ultimately manageable. Their physiology was unremarkable. No natural armor plating, no venom sacs, no built-in weaponry to speak of. They tired easily compared to most species, required frequent rest periods, and their fragile skin damaged at the slightest provocation. In short, they seemed harmless. Useful for negotiations and technical positions certainly, but hardly warrior material. The instructors would have done well to ask why humanity needed such an extensive military in the first place. The morning briefing room smelled of ozone and the particular musk that Hectarian cadets produced when anxious. Commander Vrel Tok, a Saurian whose scales had dulled to the silver gray of 40 campaigns, swept his gaze across the assembled squads with the resignation of someone required to pretend this exercise mattered. Combat Simulation 774, he announced, his translator chip rendering his hissing speech into flat Concordat standard. Hostile environment, limited resources, objective-based scenario. Squad Theta, you will defend the Northern Quadrant facility. Squad Kappa, you will assault and capture said facility. Rules of engagement follow standard Vorten protocols. Honor challenges must be accepted. 3-second warning before engagement. No strikes to non-combatants or those who yield. A Kralox cadet in the front row clicked his mandibles appreciatively. The insectoid. Species loved these exercises. Their natural chitinous plating gave them substantial advantages in drawn-out combat, and their cultural obsession with warrior honor meant they'd spent centuries perfecting intimidation displays. Environmental conditions will include atmospheric moisture at 92%, temperature variations between standard and 15 degrees below, and terrain mixing jungle canopy with lowland marsh zones. Visibility will be compromised. Vreltok paused, his inner eyelid flickering. Squad Kappa, you have one human integrated into your unit. Standard precautions apply. Several cadets glanced toward the back of the room where she stood, quietly checking her equipment harness with methodical precision. Human females were smaller than their males, the academic briefings had explained, and this one barely reached the chest height of most species present. Her skin was a brown that reminded some species of nutrient-rich soil, her hair pulled back in the tight configuration humans called practical. She didn't look up during the briefing, focused entirely on her gear check with an intensity that might have warned a more observant species. Cadet Thorn, a Hectarian whose purple skin marked him as minor nobility, leaned toward his squadmate. Keep the human toward the rear. Their endurance is poor. She'll slow us down if she's exposed to actual combat. Agreed, chittered Zesik, the squad's Verpine scout. His compound eyes reflected fractured versions of the human. No offense to interspecies cooperation, but her kind isn't built for this. The human cadet said nothing. She finished her equipment check, noted the power cell status on her training rifle, and adjusted the combat knife on her thigh with fingers that didn't tremble. Commander Vreltok continued. This exercise will be monitored from the command center. Instructors will evaluate tactical decision-making, adherence to combat protocols, and demonstration of species-specific advantages. Lethal force is simulated. Your weapons are set to neural disruption that will register as kills without permanent damage. However, bladed weapons remain real for authenticity purposes. You are expected to demonstrate control. The human's hand had stilled on her knife handle for just a moment. Then she nodded once, to no one in particular. You have 30 minutes to reach your designated zones. Combat authorization begins at mark 700. Dismissed. The squads filed out with the organized chaos of youth trying to project military discipline. Squad Kappa gathered at their transport platform, and Thorn immediately began assigning positions. I'll take point. Zesik, you're on sensors. Miravel, you handle communication relay. He turned to the human, his face plates shifting in what his species considered a kindly expression. You stay center rear position, call out if you spot anything, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary. We'll handle the actual combat. Understood, she replied. Her voice was quiet, accent still carrying those strange human inflections that the translator chips struggled with. She didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't demand a more prominent role. The other cadets took this as appropriate humility. They would later realize it was something else entirely. The transport dropped them at the northern edge of the simulation zone, and the humidity hit like a physical wall. The jungle marsh hybrid was one of Vortan's more sadistic creations. Thick canopy that blocked 60% of light, standing water that made every step uncertain, and ambient sounds designed to mask enemy movement. It was meant to be challenging. Thorn deployed his squad with textbook precision. Sesik's sensors swept for opposing force signatures. Miravel established communication protocols. The human took her assigned position without comment, her eyes moving across the terrain with an expression that was difficult to read. Sensor contact, Zesik reported after 15 minutes of careful advance. Kralok's pattern, Squad Omega likely. They're moving toward the facility from the eastern approach. Numbers? Thorn asked. 5 confirmed. Standard assault formation. Thorn's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. Squad Omega was led by Krexthar, a Kralok's warrior from a decorated military bloodline. This would be a proper engagement. Challenges issued, combat joined with appropriate ceremony, victory or defeat earned with honor. We intercept before they reach the facility, Thorn decided. Form up for honor challenge formation. We'll issue proper combat declarations and— Contact close, Zesik interrupted, his antennae snapping upright. They're moving faster than projected. There, the Kraloks burst through the vegetation with the theatrical flair their species favored. Krexthar stood at the front, his chitinous armor gleaming with ritual engravings, mandibles spread wide in the traditional pre-combat display. He was impressive, nearly 3 meters of evolved predator, his forearms each capable of wielding weapons independently. Squad Kappa, Krexthar's voice boomed, his translator cranked to maximum volume. I, Krexthar of Clan Vel Shera, issue formal challenge to your strongest warrior. Let us meet in single combat to determine— He stopped speaking. Not because he finished his statement, but because a human female had crossed the 12 meters between them in absolute silence and put 15 centimeters of carbon steel blade through the weak point where his thorax met his abdomen. The entire clearing went silent. Krexthar looked down at the knife protruding from his torso, the neural disruptor chip in the blade registering a kill shot. His legs folded. He collapsed into the marsh water with a splash that seemed obscenely loud in the sudden quiet. The human withdrew her blade, wiped it on her thigh, and returned it to its sheath. The entire sequence had taken 3 seconds. Maybe 4, if you counted the return to starting position. She keyed her communication unit. Threat neutralized. Requesting next objective. Squad leader. 23 cadets stared at her. 11 from Squad Kappa. 12 from Squad Omega. Their species-specific expressions of shock varied. Mandible dropping, scale bristling, pattern changing. But the sentiment was universal. What in the name of every sacred star cluster just happened? Thorn found his voice first. You didn't issue challenge. You didn't provide warning period. You didn't... I followed standard engagement protocols, the human said calmly, her breathing barely elevated. Hostile force detected, threat assessed, optimal neutralization method employed. The 3-second warning applies to non-combatants. He was leading an assault squad in active combat exercise. He was armed and advancing. But the honor, started one of the Kraloks from Squad Omega. Isn't listed in the engagement parameters, she finished. She looked at Thorn. Squad leader, we have a time-sensitive objective. The facility needs securing. Should we proceed? In the command center 3 kilometers away, 5 instructors sat in frozen silence, watching the holographic replay from 4 different angles. Commander Vreltok's tongue flicked out nervously. Did that human female just... Confirmed kill in 3.2 seconds, confirmed the Verpine tactical analyst, his voice hollow with disbelief. Target neutralized before completing challenge declaration. Movement pattern suggests she initiated attack sequence before target finished speaking his name. The human liaison officer, a grizzled male with gray threading through his hair and scars suggesting he'd seen actual combat rather than just simulations, took a slow drink from his beverage container. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. You're going to want to stop the exercise now, he said quietly. Because of one unexpected engagement? Vreltok's scales rippled with annoyance. That's an overreaction. She'll be disciplined for protocol violations, but... She didn't violate protocols, the human interrupted. She followed them exactly. Your protocols just assume everyone fights the way you do. He set down his beverage. They assume everyone treats combat as a sport instead of survival. The Concordat has maintained civilized warfare standards for how many wars has the Concordat actually fought, the human asked. Not exercises, not honor duels, actual wars where the objective was to kill the other side before they killed you? The silence stretched uncomfortably. That's what I thought, the human liaison continued. You've had 3 centuries of peace and you've convinced yourselves that's because you're civilized. It's not. It's because you're isolated. No external threats, just internal politics settled with acceptable violence. He gestured at the holographic display showing the human cadet calmly moving through the marsh. My species had global wars, multiple. We got very, very good at killing each other efficiently. When you invited us to join your Concordat, we didn't forget those lessons. We just hoped we wouldn't need them. This is a training exercise for cadets, Vreltok protested, not actual warfare. Tell that to her, the liaison said, pointing at the display. On screen, the human had just eliminated 2 more Kraloks cadets. Same efficiency, same silence, same 3-second sequence. Her squad mates were following her now, instinctively, their carefully learned formations abandoned in favor of simply staying behind the terrifying creature who moved through combat like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance, finding every gap, every weakness, every opportunity. The communication channels lit up across the simulation zone like a small star going supernova. Squad Omega, what remained of it, was screaming for reinforcement, not requesting, screaming. Priority threat, Northern Quadrant, human cadet, request immediate backup. Squad leader Thorn found himself in the unprecedented position of following orders from someone who technically held no command authority. The human had simply started moving with such confidence, such absolute certainty of purpose, that his military training overrode his species' prejudice. When someone clearly knows what they're doing in a crisis, you follow them. It's instinct. She's flanking toward the ridgeline, Zesek reported, his sensors tracking the human's movement. That's not the optimal path to the facility. Yes, it is, Miravel countered, her crystalline thought processes analyzing terrain data. If we assume the defending squads will reinforce from the eastern approach, expecting us to continue current trajectory, but she's predicting their prediction and positioning for intercept of their reinforcement route. Then, she paused. That's 3 levels of tactical anticipation. Do humans process combat mathematics that quickly? I don't think she's processing it, Thorne said slowly, watching the human move through the marsh with movements that seemed almost casual. I think she just knows. The human had stopped talking to them entirely, her communication discipline absolute. She used hand signals now, simple, efficient gestures that somehow transcended species differences. Stop, move, threat direction. Her squad mates found themselves understanding perfectly, their own extensive training and complex tactical communication suddenly feeling overcomplicated. She'd also stopped using her neural disruptor rifle. Too loud, apparently. Too obvious. The knife came out again, and Thorne felt something cold settle in his primary stomach when he realized she was hunting. Not fighting. Hunting. There's a difference that most concordat species had forgotten over their centuries of civilized warfare. Fighting is what you do when you encounter an enemy. Hunting is what you do when you decide something needs to die and you're willing to pursue it until that objective is achieved. The human was hunting. Cadet Relics of Squad Delta learned this distinction when he took up what he believed was a concealed sniper position overlooking the approach to the facility. Good elevation, excellent cover, perfect sight lines. He'd reported his position to his squad leader and settled in to provide covering fire. He never saw her coming. The first indication something was wrong came when his communication unit died. The second came when he felt breath on his neck that shouldn't be there because nothing had been behind him 30 seconds ago when he checked. The third came when neural disruptor shock hit his system, and his last conscious thought was a simple one. How? The human retrieved her knife, marked his weapon as neutralized per exercise protocols, and moved on. She'd taken 4 minutes to circle completely around the defending position, bypass 3 sensor nets, climb a vertical surface that should have required specialized equipment, and eliminate a target from his own species' preferred attack vector. In the command center, the human liaison officer had given up trying to convince the instructors to stop the exercise. Instead, he'd pulled up a holographic display of Earth and started showing them history files. This is human military history from approximately 4,000 years ago to present, he explained, highlighting conflicts across the rotating globe. Notice anything? The wars never stopped, whispered a Hectarian tactical instructor. There's always conflict, somewhere. Now notice where they happened, the liaison continued. Different continents, different cultures, different time periods. My species fought itself in every climate, every terrain type, every possible environmental condition. Jungle, desert, Arctic, mountains, oceans, underground, eventually in space. We didn't have the luxury of controlled honor duels. We had survival pressure. But surely your species evolved past such violence when you achieved space travel, Vreltalk protested. The natural progression of civilization. We achieved space travel during our largest global conflict, the liaison interrupted. We literally developed rocket technology to drop explosives on each other more efficiently. Then we went to space and kept fighting there too. He pulled up genetic analysis charts. You want to know why humans have such good pattern recognition? Because the ones who couldn't spot predators died. Want to know why we have excellent endurance? Because we used to chase prey animals until they literally died of exhaustion. It's called persistence hunting. Want to know why we're so good at throwing things accurately? Because we've been killing each other and everything else with projectiles for hundreds of thousands of years. He zoomed in on the display showing the cadet's current position. That female down there? She's not extraordinary by human standards. She's average,
maybe slightly above average in physical conditioning, but her tactics, her instincts, her approach to combat, that's just normal human military training. We teach every soldier to think like that. Like what? Asked the Verpine analyst, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and didn't like it. Like something that kills to survive, the liaison said quietly, because for most of our history, that's exactly what we were. The human cadet had reached what she designated as an optimal position, a small rise overlooking the main approach to the facility where 3 defensive squads would converge. Her own squad had caught up, moving quieter now, learning from her without being explicitly taught. Thorne crouched beside her, careful not to silhouette himself against the sky. "There are 15 defenders between us and the objective," he said quietly. "We're 5. Even with your methods, those odds are manageable," she said, her eyes scanning the terrain below. She wasn't looking at where the enemies were. She was looking at where they would be. "They're going to panic. They've been communicating about us for 20 minutes. They know we eliminated Squad Omega. They're expecting us to attack directly." "So we don't?" Cesic asked. "So we do," she corrected. "But we make them think there are more of us than there are. Humans call it force multiplication through psychological manipulation." "That's," Miravel searched for the word, "underhanded." The human finally looked at her, and there was something in her eyes that made the crystalline being's internal structure resonate with instinctive unease. "Yes," the human agreed. "War is underhanded. That's why it's war and not a game." She explained the plan in 30 seconds. It was simple, brutal, and completely disregarded every principle of honorable combat the Concordat held sacred. It worked perfectly. The humans started by leaving signs of passage, broken branches, disturbed mud, equipment marks, in 4 different locations, suggesting a much larger force. Then she used her squad's communication units to broadcast fragments of conversation on frequencies she knew the defenders were monitoring, creating the impression of multiple squads coordinating an assault. The defending squads repositioned, spreading out to counter the perceived larger threat. Then she went through them like a knife through vapor. There's a particular kind of fear that comes from not knowing where the threat is. The Concordat species, with their honor-bound face-to-face combat traditions, had no cultural framework for dealing with an enemy who simply refused to be seen until the moment of attack. They kept looking for the formal challenge, the declaration of intent, the opponent standing visible and proud. The human gave them none of it. She came from angles that shouldn't have been possible. She struck from distances that seemed too far for close. Combat. She used the environment itself as a weapon. Loose rocks that caused defenders to stumble, hanging vines that obscured movement, water that muffled sound. Every natural advantage that existed, she found and exploited. And the knife, always the knife. Neural disruptor rifles were for when she couldn't get close. The knife was for when she could, and she could get close more often than should have been physically possible. Cadet Brenthor, a decorated Saurian from a military family, found himself staring at his squad leader's body with the neutralized indicator blinking above it and absolutely no memory of seeing what killed him. One moment he'd been there, the next moment he was down, and there was a human female sprinting away toward the next target before his species' slower reaction time could even process raising his weapon. "She's not real," Brenthor said into his communication unit, his voice shaking. "She can't be real. Nothing moves like that. Nothing thinks like that." "All units, converge on the facility," ordered Squad Commander Krelvin, trying to maintain some tactical cohesion. "We defend the objective point, force her to come to us in open ground where we can—" The communication cut off. Krelvin's status indicator switched to neutralized. The human had gone through the command unit position like it wasn't even there. In the command center, they'd stopped analyzing tactics and started running biological comparisons. The data was unsettling. Human reaction time, 0.25 seconds on average, the Verpine analyst reported.
That's 40% faster than Kralox, 30% faster than Saurian, 60% faster than Hectarian. Endurance capacity, another instructor added, reading from his display. Humans can maintain combat effectiveness for 6 to 8 hours continuously. Most species manage 2 to 3 before significant degradation. Pattern recognition and threat assessment, continued a third voice. They process environmental data and identify tactical advantages at speeds comparable to AI-assisted analysis. Except it's not AI, it's just how their brains developed. Temperature regulation, someone else noted with growing horror. They can fight effectively in temperature ranges that would incapacitate most of us. They cool themselves through liquid secretion. They can literally run until everything else dies, and they're still functional. Commander Vreltalk had been quiet for several minutes, watching the holographic display with the expression of someone having their worldview fundamentally restructured. "They're not civilized," he said finally. "We thought they were civilized because they use diplomacy and follow our protocols, but that's just adaptation, camouflage." "No," the human liaison corrected, his voice carrying an edge now. "We're civilized because we choose to be, despite what we're capable of. That's what makes it civilization, the choice. You've been civilized because you've never had to choose anything else." He stood, moving closer to the display showing the human cadet approaching the facility's final defensive position. "What you are seeing down there isn't a human being uncivilized. That's a human being extremely civilized while doing something we're naturally very, very good at. Which is killing things that need to die so that things we care about can live," the liaison said simply. The final confrontation happened at the facility entrance, and it was almost anticlimactic in its brevity. Krexthar's sibling, Vexthar, had been waiting. He was larger than his brother, more decorated, with scars from actual combat missions on his carapace. When the human approached, finally visible, finally in open ground, he stepped forward with all the ceremony his culture demanded. "Human," he declared, his 4 arms spreading wide in challenge position. "I am Vexthar of Clan Velshara. My brother fell dishonorably. I challenge you now to proper combat, that his name might be—" She shot him. Neural disruptor, center mass, from 15 meters away. He went down like a collapsed building. Vexthar's second-in-command stared in disbelief. He was issuing formal challenge. "You can't just—" The human shot her too. Then she walked to the facility entrance, placed her hand on the access panel, and activated the objective completion signal. The exercise simulation ended with a tone that sounded across the entire zone. In the sudden silence, the human turned to face the remaining cadets, both her squad and the defenders who were still conscious. Dozens of eyes stared at her with expressions ranging from fear to awe to something that might have been reverence. "The objective was to capture the facility," she said calmly, holstering her weapon. "Mission accomplished. Total time, 43 minutes, 17 seconds. Then she did something that somehow made it worse. She walked over to Vexithar, whose neural disruptor shock was wearing off, and extended her hand. The gesture was recognizable across most species, an offer of assistance. "Good defensive positioning," she told him as she helped the massive Kralox to his feet. "Your squad held longer than I anticipated, made me use more ammunition than I wanted." Vexithar stared at her with his compound eyes, mandibles moving silently as his translator struggled to process the cognitive dissonance between the warrior who'd just demolished his entire defensive line and the small, smiling creature now complementing his tactics. What are you?" he finally managed. She looked genuinely confused by the question. "Cadet, 2nd class, human, standard infantry training." She glanced around at the assembled cadets. "Is there a problem?" The debriefing session was the most uncomfortable hour in Vortan Military Institute's 300-year history. Commander Vreltalk stood at the front of the room, his scales shifting through colors that indicated he was cycling through several competing emotional states. The human cadet sat in the front row, looking attentive and slightly confused about why this was taking so long. Your tactics, Vreltok began carefully, while effective, disregarded several fundamental principles of Concordat military tradition. Did I violate any written regulations, sir? She asked. No, he admitted, but the spirit of, with respect, Commander, I was taught that in combat situations, interpretation of spirit versus letter of regulations costs lives. Her voice remained even, respectful. Was this not a combat simulation designed to train us for actual military operations? It was designed to teach honorable engagement principles, a Kralox instructor interjected, to show that even in warfare, we maintain our civilization. By making warfare predictable, the human asked. She wasn't being confrontational. Her tone suggested genuine curiosity. Sir, with respect, if both sides know exactly how the fight will proceed, then combat outcomes are determined by who has the better equipment or more soldiers, not who has the better tactical thinking. That means wars get won by bigger economies, more resources. That's not skill or honor, that's just math. The room went very quiet. You're saying honor is inefficient, Vreltok said slowly. I'm saying honor is a luxury, she corrected. When you can afford it, it's beautiful. It makes us better than our worst instincts. But building a military doctrine around the assumption that your enemy will also value honor. She shook her head. That's not preparation. That's hope. And hope isn't a strategy. The human liaison officer, standing at the back of the room, felt a mixture of pride and resignation. She was right, of course. The Concordat had built its entire military structure on the assumption that everyone would fight fair. They'd been lucky that they'd never encountered anyone who didn't. What would you have us teach then? Asked a Hectarian tactical instructor, his tone sharp. That honor is meaningless, that we should all fight like something is actually at stake? The human finished. No, sir. I think honor should absolutely be taught. I think it should be valued. I think it's one of the things that makes civilization worth defending. She leaned forward slightly. But I also think you should teach us to win, because if we lose, honor doesn't matter. The other side writes the history. Into the uncomfortable silence that followed, a voice spoke from the doorway. She has a name now, Vexthar said, limping into the room with two of his squad mates supporting him. Protocol dictated that cadets didn't interrupt officer debriefings, but the Kralox warrior seemed to have decided that some things transcended protocol. In our language, the others are already using it. Cadet Vexthar, Vreltok began, his voice carrying warning. Death whisper, the Kralox continued, ignoring the commander. He looked directly at the human. Because you move in silence and leave only death behind. It's what warriors in the old stories were called before we became civilized. The human looked uncomfortable. That's really not necessary. I was just doing the exercise. You did more than the exercise, Vexthar said, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect or fear or both. You showed us what we'd forgotten, what it means to actually fight. To actually hunt, corrected another voice. Brenthor, the Saurian cadet, had entered behind Vexthar. We've been training as soldiers. You trained as a predator. I trained as a human soldier, she protested. This is standard for us. That statement hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. The human liaison officer closed his eyes, knowing what was coming. What had always been inevitable once humanity joined the Concordat and started integrating into its institutions. All of you, Vreltok said slowly, looking at the human cadet. All humans fight like this? Our special forces are better, she admitted. I'm just regular infantry track. Sir, I really don't understand the issue. You gave us an objective-based combat simulation with victory conditions and rules of engagement. I achieved the objective within the rules. Isn't that what soldiers are supposed to do? Yes, Vreltok said quietly. Yes, it is. That's precisely the problem. The meeting ended without any formal resolution because there was no protocol for what to do when an entire military tradition gets deconstructed by a second-year cadet in 43 minutes and 17 seconds. But changes started immediately. By nightfall, the nickname had spread through the entire academy. Death Whisper became a legend before most cadets had even seen her face. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, until some versions had her eliminating 30 opponents single-handedly, while others had her vanishing completely and attacking from dimensions that didn't exist. The truth was somehow more disturbing than the legends. Human cadets were quietly moved to a separate training track labeled Special Operations Integration. Requests came in from a dozen squads wanting humans assigned to their units, not for honor, but because having something that could move and think and kill like that on your side suddenly seemed more important than maintaining traditional species compositions. The curriculum changed. Instructors began teaching counter-ambush tactics, irregular warfare theory, psychological operations basics, things they'd stopped teaching centuries ago because civilized species didn't need them. They needed them now, because humanity had arrived, and humanity had spent its entire evolutionary history learning one lesson very. Survival doesn't care about honor. Survival cares about who's still breathing when the fight ends. The human cadet, Death Whisper, though she'd never used the name herself, returned to her quarters that night, exhausted from the debriefing and confused about why everyone was making such a big deal about a standard training exercise. She cleaned her knife with the automatic precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, checked her equipment for the next day's classes, and fell asleep within minutes. She dreamed of nothing in particular. The galaxy, meanwhile, lay awake and reconsidered everything it thought it knew about warfare, civilization, and the small species from a yellow star that had just demonstrated why apex predators don't need claws or armor or natural weapons. They have something better. They have 500,000 years of practice. And in the darkness of the Vorten moon, Commander Vreltalk sat in his office and composed a report to the Concordat military command with trembling claws. The message was simple, but its implications were galaxy-shaking. Recommend immediate tactical doctrine review. Human integration successful. Perhaps too successful. They don't fight like us. They fight like something that evolved to win. Request guidance on how to proceed when one species' standard training makes them exceptional by everyone else's standards. Also request guidance on what happens when the rest of the galaxy realizes the same thing. He sent the message and wondered, not for the first time that day, if inviting humanity to join the Concordat had been wisdom or the greatest strategic blunder in modern history. Probably both, he decided. Definitely both. The stars turned overhead, uncaring and eternal, as they had for billions of years. They'd seen species rise and fall, empires born and destroyed, wars fought and peace achieved. They would see what came next, too. But even the stars, if they could speak, might have admitted to a certain curiosity about what happens when a galaxy built on civilized warfare meets a species that never forgot how to fight like their existence depended on it, because sometimes it did, and sometimes those lessons stay learned.